Have you ever tried to pass on information so earth-shattering that you felt if people simply knew, everything would change? But instead of acting on it, they chose to bury their heads in the sand. That reaction is called willful blindness. And this notion occurs all around us every day, from something as small as ignoring an extramarital affair to corporate accidents like the BP oil spill and even mass atrocities like the rise of the Third Reich. Well, my next guest wrote the book on willful blindness. Her name is Heffernan, and she's analyzed countless case studies on the human response to truth. She joined me earlier, and I first asked her to go over the example of Libby, Montana, where one woman discovered that her town had an 80 times higher mortality rate than anywhere else in the U.S.
That is really one of the most extraordinary cases I came across, where the evidence was incontrovertible that the town was being poisoned. People's friends, families, neighbors were dying of asbestosis, which is a long, expensive, and painful way to die. And even though Gayla Benefield got attention for this, and in fact got help for it, there were people who deeply resented the work that she was doing. And they made bumper stickers that said, "I'm from Libby, Montana, and no, I don't have asbestosis." You know, they were determined not to see what was right in front of them.
You know, Margaret, even on this show, when I talk about different issues that I do, people say, no, that isn't possible because either the media would have told me or the government wouldn't do that because they care about us too much. Margaret, what's your response to these types of excuses for willful blindness?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I understand the argument. I was having that argument actually with my husband the other day. And he was saying, oh, you know, if this were happening, we'd know about it. And I'd say, you mean like the way we knew about the Iraq War before it happened, and the way that we knew about subprime? You know, there are a lot of things that it turns out the media doesn't cover. You know, the dog that doesn't bark. So as much respect as I have for the media, I think, unfortunately, there are great cases where it has absolutely turned a blind eye. But I think it's very important to understand this isn't bad people, and it isn't bad institutions particularly. This is human nature. There's a lot of human biology that contributes to this. And so what's much more important is to understand the systemic risk, to understand why are we as humans willfully blind, and therefore what can we as humans do to be more courageous, to be better sighted, and to really have the nerve and the courage to look at the things we kind of most want not to.
And, you know, and you're saying even if the information is presented to me on a platter right here, it's not just that it's out there, it could be right in front of your face.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't mean that change will happen.
Correct.
So what is that next step to make change happen?
Well, I think there are a whole bunch of things. I mean, one of the stories that I tell in my book is about a doctor in England who showed that the rising rate of childhood cancers could be attributed to the practice of X-raying pregnant women. And in the US and the UK, it took 25 years before people stopped doing that. Why did they stop eventually? Well, partly because she didn't give up. So I think one thing that's really important when people see things going wrong, that they have the courage and the confidence to speak up, and that when they're rebuffed, they don't think, oh, well, I was wrong or it was pointless. They keep at it. And I think this is really important because the more they do, the more courage other people get to do the same thing. I think the other thing that's really important is that in many companies and organizations where I've worked, it actually takes very little to tip the balance. You know, I write a lot about the hard cases, if you like. But it's extraordinary how if you can just ask the right question in a meeting, for example, when everybody's ignoring the elephant in the room, and just a gentle question like, is everybody really convinced this is safe? Or how could we be more confident this is safe? Asking the question alone often gives other people the courage and the confidence they need to express their doubts too. Because usually in these cases, it isn't that nobody can see it, it's that everybody can see it, and everybody's pretending not to. It takes very little to tip that balance sometimes.
You actually found the statistics behind how much silence actually does incur across these organizations. What was that?
Yeah, this is really challenging. This is some fantastic research that came out of New York University that showed that when asked, executives were asked, did they have issues or concerns at work that they didn't voice? And 85% of them said they did. Now, that's a very high proportion. And I think it goes a long way to explaining what is one of the biggest problems that CEOs agonize about, which is, how come I hire all these brilliant people, educated, smart, articulate, and I get so little out of them? And, well, the 85% silence could explain a lot. It's not that they aren't thinking, it's that they're not conveying their thoughts. And so that has a lot to do often with particular cultures, with our desire to fit in, our desire not to stand out. It has a lot to do with whether or not we feel it's safe to speak up. And it has a lot to do with whether or not we're working in environments where the leaders understand that debate, conflict, friction is quite a creative act, or it can be. And that if there isn't enough debate in an organization, there won't be much creativity, there won't be much innovation, and far from being comfortable, the organization is actually most at risk.
Which brings me to the concept of whistleblowers, which you kind of break down the mythology surrounding whistleblowers as fringe, as crazy. Talk about how this mythology fits into the concept of willful blindness applied to Edward Snowden and the NSA leaks.
Well, so I think whistleblowers are really interesting because, as you say, there's a lot of mythology around them. What you typically find, though, with whistleblowers is, they're mostly not crazy, they're not antisocial, they're not weird. Actually, what you find is that they're fantastically dedicated, committed individuals. What upset Snowden about what he found was that snooping on citizens felt to him so un-American. I'm sure he would describe himself as a profound patriot. And in many cases of whistleblowing, what you find is that these are incredibly dedicated, loyal, committed people who are distraught by the fact that the organization that they serve is not living up to the principles that they espouse. Very often, and I know this wasn't the case with Snowden, but very often with many whistleblowers, what happens is they try to get attention to the problem through the proper channels. And of course, if they succeed, we never hear about them, right? Those are the happy ending stories. It's when they're endlessly rebuffed that they then kind of step outside the line. And one of the arguments that I make regularly with organizations is, if you have the right attitude and processes in place to listen to these people, they will solve your problems before you even see them. So take them seriously. Don't marginalize them. Don't castigate them. Don't think they're all cranks and crazies. Listen to what it is they're trying to say. They may not always be right, but listening is a lot safer.
And I'm worried about, his revelations creating a lot of willful blindness about the programs that he did reveal, and I really hope that we can galvanize some real change on that front. But you just brought up another good point, which is kind of listening, opening ourselves up to the dialogue of people that we normally wouldn't give credence to. You talk about the importance of disagreeing, creating conflict. Talk about why humans should create conflict, because that goes against everything that we've been told.
Right. Well, it's really interesting because if you look at how the neural networks in our brain are formed, they're really built to make our thoughts and our responses much faster and much easier. And what that means is that whenever we encounter something that's familiar, we'll prioritize that information. It will just feel better. It will be conscious faster. And so our minds are kind of built biologically to attract and process and prioritize the stuff we agree with and slow down or forget about the stuff that we don't agree with. And that's why if we have certain political views, we buy certain newspapers, we watch certain news channels, and so on. Actually, to be smart and well-informed and thoughtful, we need to encounter the people, the attitudes, the information, the opinions that we're uncomfortable with. Not necessarily because we're wrong, but because that's what thinking is. It's taking alternative perspectives seriously and having a dialogue with other people and having a dialogue with oneself, which is, what the philosopher Hannah Arendt calls thinking, which is, am I sure about this? How do I know? What's the opposite attitude? What's the contravening information? How can I be certain that my opinions are grounded and sound? And I think it's quite alarming, really, in the United States and also, in Europe, that we have, on the whole, highly polarized media where conflict, contradiction, debate is not really pursued. Instead, we're simply feeding people's established biases and prejudices. That isn't thinking, and it isn't safe.
Extremely well said. And Margaret, you've basically blown my mind about another concept, competition. You have an upcoming book called A Bigger Prize where you examine how damaging competition can be between humans. I mean, once again, flies in the face of everything we've been told. Capitalism based on the foundation of competition that leads to better technology, more prosperity, better rewards.
Yeah.
You disagree. Yeah. Why?
I have to say, this is a really scary book. I mean, it's one thing to stand up and say you don't believe in God. People can kind of tolerate that. Standing up and saying you don't believe in competition, much, much more frightening. But actually, when you think about it, I think we all know it doesn't work. We wouldn't have regulation if it worked. We wouldn't put in place rules and processes to stem the side effects of competition if those side effects didn't exist. So what I've done is I've really looked at, well, if we allow ourselves the dangerous thought that maybe competition doesn't always work and the best doesn't always get to the top, how in fact does it work? And it's quite a challenging and shocking notion that actually the more competitive you make schools, the more you teach kids to cheat at an earlier age. Rush Kidder at the Institute for Ethics estimates that by the time our kids get to college, 95% of them will have cheated on some exam. That's in college. And then we're surprised if they cheat when they get to work. You look at in the field of sports, the higher the stakes, the more the money, the bigger the prizes, the more the doping. The more we use competitions in high-stakes games, the more the outcomes are what economists call perverse outcomes, as if they're not bound to happen, which is to do with cheating, corruption, inequality. This is a real concern because increasingly what I find in governments and in companies, because nobody can make their mind up or because they're not willing to defend their positions, they're saying increasingly, just let the market decide. This is a profound abdication. We can't let markets decide everything because markets get it wrong. They're not fair, they're unequal, people use secret information, there are profound disequilibriums in markets. There is no free market anywhere. So if that's the case, we need to think very, very carefully about how and when and where we use competition to answer the questions that we should be able to answer in more thoughtful ways.
A lot of huge ideas. It's time to start applying them in our lives. Thank you so much, Margaret Heffernan, entrepreneur, author of the upcoming book, A Bigger Prize. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Have you ever tried to pass on information so earth-shattering that you felt if people simply knew, everything would change? But instead of acting on it, they chose to bury their heads in the sand. That reaction is called willful blindness. And this notion occurs all around us every day, from something as small as ignoring an extramarital affair to corporate accidents like the BP oil spill and even mass atrocities like the rise of the Third Reich. Well, my next guest wrote the book on willful blindness. Her name is Margaret Heffernan, and she's analyzed countless case studies on the human response to truth. She joined me earlier, and I first asked her to go over the example of Libby, Montana, where one woman...
Even though Gayla Benefield got attention for this, and in fact got help for it, there were people who deeply resented the work that she was doing, and they made bumper stickers that said, I'm from Libby, Montana, and no, I don't have asbestosis. They were determined not to see what was right in front of them.
Margaret, even on this show, when I talk about different issues that I do, people discovered that her town had an 80 times higher mortality rate than anywhere else in the U.S.
That is really one of the most extraordinary cases I came across where the evidence was incontrovertible that the town was being poisoned. people's friends, families, neighbors were dying of asbestosis, which is a long, expensive, and painful way to die. And
people say, no, that isn't possible because either the media would have told me or the government wouldn't do that because they care about us too much. Margaret, what's your response to these types of excuses for willful blindness?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I understand the argument. I was having that argument actually with my husband the other day. And he was saying, oh, you know, if this were happening, we'd know about it. And I